In 1900, the New Zealand government made it official and declared gorse a noxious weed. This is a thorny shrub that grows taller than a grown man, smothers the grass underneath it, and goes up like kindling the moment the weather turns dry. For almost 90 years afterward, people threw everything they had at it. They burned it, they sprayed it with poison, they tore it out of the ground with bulldozers. And for almost 90 years, the weed won every single time. Then, in September 1987, a botanist named Hugh Wilson was handed 109 hectares of farmland buried under this exact weed from fence to fence, and he told his neighbors something none of them wanted to hear. He would not spray it, he would not burn it, he would not dig it out. He was simply going to let the gorse grow. 2 weeks later, a letter showed up from a farmer down the road. It called Hugh Wilson a fool and a dreamer, and it predicted that within 10 years he would wreck his own land and every farm around it along with it. 39 years later, there's a forest standing on that land, one with more than 50 year-round waterfalls and native birds that hadn't been heard on that coast in decades. And the gorse that was supposed to ruin everything is almost entirely gone. It killed itself. The strangest part of all, the man who did this never planted a single tree. Gorse is a thorny, fast-growing shrub, taller than a person at full height, and by any farmer's definition, it is a disaster. It smothers pasture, it shelters rabbits and rats, it burns violently in dry weather. That's the plant the government outlawed in 1900, and for the 90 years after that, farmers burned it, sprayed it with poison, and tore it out with bulldozers and chains. And on farm after farm, it simply came back, thicker, denser, and angrier than before. Here is the part almost nobody in New Zealand knew at the time. The country planted this enemy itself. Gorse isn't native. It was brought over deliberately by early European settlers as a cheap, thorny living fence, a hedge that kept livestock in without the cost of timber or wire. Charles Darwin, passing through New Zealand as a young naturalist in 1835, actually saw these hedges going in. People spent decades planting the very plant they would then spend the next century trying to destroy. By the mid-1980s, one particular stretch of farmland on Banks Peninsula, on New Zealand's South Island, had become a textbook case of losing that war. The land sits on a peninsula that was, before people arrived, covered edge to edge in native forest. From the mountain ridges all the way down to the shoreline, Europeans logged it first, selling the timber for houses and ships. What survived logging was then burned and plowed to clear pasture for sheep. In under 50 years, nearly the entire forest was gone. What grew back in its place, on the steep abandoned corners of that farmland, was gorse. The farmer who owned this particular block did everything by the book. He sprayed it, he burned it, he sent bulldozers through it. Every single time, the gorse returned even thicker than before. By the time he finally gave up and sold the land, gorse covered essentially the whole property. The man who bought that ruined farm in September 1987 was not a farmer at all. Maurice White was an accountant who had spent years quietly saving money toward one specific goal: buying a piece of land on Banks Peninsula and bringing back the native birdsong he remembered from childhood. Birdsong that, by the 1980s, had almost entirely disappeared from the peninsula. White knew nothing about ecology, but he had the money to buy 109 hectares of that ruined, gorse-choked farmland, and he had the good sense to hire someone who did understand the land, a botanist named Hugh Wilson. Wilson was not some outside consultant with a theory to test. He had already spent 5 years surveying the entire Banks Peninsula on foot, alone, dividing it into a grid and walking more than 1,300 separate sample plots, in some cases being lowered down sheer cliff faces on a rope to reach them. By the time Maurice White handed him the land, Hugh Wilson likely understood that coastline better than any living person, including what it used to look like before people, sheep, and gorse ever arrived, which is exactly why he was confident enough to make the neighbor's letter look, in hindsight, like the worst prediction in the district's history. Everyone who had ever looked at a gorse thicket had looked at it from the outside, a yellow thorny wall and nothing more. Hugh Wilson did something nobody else had bothered to do. He physically pushed into the thickets and looked down at the ground underneath, and there, protected in the shade of the thorns, were native tree seedlings, species that could not survive out in the open pasture, growing without any help from anyone. Nobody had planted them. Birds had simply carried the seeds in from the last surviving patches of old forest nearby, and under the cover of the gorse, those seeds were finally getting a chance to grow. That observation explained two things at once. It explained why something was quietly working inside the hated thickets, and it explained why 90 years of chemical spraying, burning, and bulldozing had failed completely. The answer was in the seed itself. Gorse seeds can lie dormant in the soil for decades, far longer than the working life of any farmer fighting them. A seed can simply wait, and what wakes a dormant gorse seed up is disturbance. Heat cracks its hard outer shell, and a plow or a bulldozer blade drags buried seeds up into direct sunlight. That was the trap hiding inside every solution farmers had tried. Every time someone burned a gorse thicket or ripped it out with machinery, they weren't destroying the weed. They were sending a signal to millions of sleeping seeds underground. The light is back. Grow now. 90 years of war against gorse had, in practice, been 90 years of reseeding it by hand. New Zealand even tried biological warfare on the plant, importing 7 different insect species, including specific beetles, mites, and moths, specifically to eat gorse seeds and shoots. Every one of them did some damage. None of them came close to beating it. But gorse did have exactly one weakness. Its seeds will not sprout in deep shade. Take away the light, and the seed simply keeps waiting, which meant the only way to permanently defeat a plant with a 40-year-old seed bank in the ground was to shade it out completely. And on that ruined hillside, there was only one plant thick enough and fast-growing enough to do that: gorse itself. Here is the detail that turns this from a curiosity into a genuine ecological trick. Gorse belongs to the same plant family as peas and clover, and like them, it partners with bacteria in its roots that pull nitrogen straight out of the air and feed it into the soil. Land that decades of grazing sheep had stripped bare becomes fertile again simply by having gorse sit on it. At the same time, the thorns form a wall dense enough that no sheep or cow can push through and graze underneath it, and the canopy throws deep shade. Put those 3 things together: richer soil, protection from grazing animals, and shade, and gorse was, without meaning to, building the exact nursery conditions a forest needs to get started. Then the birds did the rest, safe inside the thorns from predators. Birds perched in the gorse and left droppings full of native seed, carried in from whatever forest remnants survived nearby. Those seeds landed in freshly enriched, protected soil, exactly where they needed to be. For the first several years, the gorse simply grew, tall and thick and unbroken. Then, after roughly a decade, something changed. The branches began to sag and break apart under their own weight. Gaps opened in the canopy, and underneath, the tree seedlings that had spent 10 years quietly growing in the shade were ready. They pushed up through the gaps, rose above the thorns, and started shading the gorse in return. A plant that cannot survive without direct sunlight, smothered by the very trees it had spent a decade protecting, simply died. It collapsed back into the soil and rotted there, feeding the forest one last time on its way out. Ecologists have a name for exactly this role: a nurse plant. Like a nurse raising a child that isn't biologically hers, the gorse sheltered, fed, and protected a forest it had no part in creating, right up until that forest didn't need it anymore, at which point it quietly disappeared. None of this convinced anyone at the time. Wilson published his observations in a scientific journal, but his neighbors believed the evidence in front of their own eyes: a wall of yellow thorns behind a fence, apparently spreading wider every year. New Zealand law actually required him to clear a strip of gorse along his property boundary, which he did, and nothing more. Every year, inspectors came out to check. Every year, the neighbors grew more convinced they'd been right about him from the start. Then a severe drought hit the district, and livestock on the surrounding farms started running out of grass. On Wilson's land, the ground underneath the gorse hadn't been trampled by stock and hadn't dried out the way open pasture had. There was still grass to be found, so Wilson opened his gates and let his neighbor's starving animals graze his land through the drought. That neighbor became a lifelong friend, and for a long stretch of years, the only one Wilson had in the district. Everything else stayed exactly the same for almost another decade. The land stayed yellow. The skepticism stayed put. Then, in 1997, 10 years after Wilson first took over the block, the gorse on the oldest part of the property began collapsing in patches, exactly where the earliest seedlings had taken hold, and real forest started rising up through the gaps. It turned out the missing piece the whole time had nothing to do with the gorse itself. It was livestock. Sheep and cattle never touched the thorny gorse. They couldn't get through it, but they ate every soft young seedling that tried to grow underneath it, right down to the ground, at exactly the rate it was trying to grow. The forest wasn't losing to the gorse, it was losing to grazing. The moment every last animal was off those slopes, the seedlings that had been waiting patiently finally got the one thing they needed: to be left alone long enough to grow taller than a sheep could reach. What was 109 hectares of ruined, gorse-choked farmland in 1987 is now part of a reserve called Hinwai, that has grown through further land purchases to well over 1,000 hectares. It contains more than 50 waterfalls that now run year-round, including one that drops 30 meters, feeding streams so clean that visitors drink straight from them. Under sheep grazing, those same streams used to run dry every summer. Bare, compacted ground can't hold water. A forest floor, full of roots and leaf litter, absorbs it like a sponge and releases it slowly across the whole year. Species that hadn't been seen or heard on that stretch of coast in decades have come back on their own. Kareroo, bellbird, tui, and other native birds, along with the New Zealand falcon, which returned entirely without human help. Giant native earthworms, over a foot long, are back in the soil, doing work only possible in a real forest. Worms that cannot survive under bare pasture at all. Even the reserve's income has shifted. Because the forest is actively growing, it now earns money from companies paying for the carbon it locks out of the atmosphere. Twice, in the years since, nature nearly undid the whole project. A 2011 fire burned through roughly a third of the reserve. A decade later, heavy rain triggered landslides that tore out paths and bridges. Both times, the recovery followed exactly the same script. Gorse was the first thing to grow back on the bare, scarred ground, and it went straight back to work, sheltering the next generation of seedlings underneath it. Interestingly, the forest that comes back isn't identical everywhere. On patches where a native shrub provided the shelter instead of gorse, a different native forest type grew back, a beech forest, closer to what stood there before people arrived. Where gorse did the sheltering, a broadleaf forest grew instead, with a different mix of native species. Both are entirely native, real original New Zealand forest. The difference is only which species got a head start under which nurse plant. And by most measures, ecologists studying the site have found the forest that came up under gorse is actually the richer of the two. More tree species, more ferns, more birds. None of this is a case for leaving gorse alone everywhere. It worked here specifically because remnants of old forests survived close enough for birds to carry seed in from, because livestock was fully removed from the slopes, and because fire was kept off the land for decades at a stretch. Drop gorse onto land with no nearby forest to seed from, and nothing grows under it for a very long time, if ever. On genuinely productive pasture, gorse is still exactly the weed it's always been, and farmers are right to keep fighting it there. This isn't a miracle. It's one very specific mechanism, and it only works where a forest still has somewhere nearby to come back from. Hugh Wilson is well into his 80s now, and he still lives on the reserve in a small solar-powered house with no car, no computer, and no mobile phone. He still handwrites and illustrates the reserve's newsletter himself, and mails paper copies out to thousands of subscribers by post. Almost 40 years ago, a neighbor wrote a letter calling him a fool and a dreamer, and promised he would ruin every farm in the district within a decade. 2 photographs on a wall, taken 30 years apart from the same spot, say otherwise. Between them, nobody planted a tree. The forest didn't need to be planted, sprayed, or saved. It needed everyone to stop touching it. If you liked this story, subscribe, because there's a lot more nature out there that's smarter than we give it credit for. And every week, I'm digging up another one. Drop a comment and tell me what you think Wilson should have done differently, or if you'd have had the patience to wait 39 years for a weed to prove you right. And if you want the next story like this one the moment it drops, hit the bell so you don't miss it.